in 2022, the Ora Report made some predictions about conflicts which lay ahead. And looking at them, I think I provided you with the Rimland article, which that's Strikeman's Rimland. How would you say, assess me ruthlessly on the countries I listed?
I honestly, I think it's all unfolding. The only thing I think you might have been a little bit too, I would say, aggressive on was the timeline.
Mm-hmm.
I think in general the trends spot on 100%. The general direction of travel and the geopolitical sort of meanderings on trend. I think that there's been a couple of setbacks, good setbacks, because if to just recap for our listeners, it was a pretty dire prediction that we were looking at, and there were some unknowns, of course, because it is a very volatile situation. But yeah, I mean, from what I would say, 8.5 out of 10. So, like, well done, really, really good stuff.
Thank you. And I have to tell you, when I started to see this whole trend emerging, I actually was looking for somebody to debunk me because it just seemed so awful. The idea of a war, Israel, Lebanon, then going into a regional conflict, the situation in Africa, it looked horrifying, and I was actually very eager for somebody to say, no, you're on the wrong track. And when October 7th happened, I have to say my blood ran cold. I saw it, in the potential it has. So I just wanted to go back to, in our first discussion, I was asking you about Africa and saying, why did the United States and the West pull out of Africa? Because we have this Russian and Chinese presence and no sign of the West. And you said, okay, well, they don't like to do this kind of business where you have to take bribes. Then by our second interview, we had elections here, and I told you, oh my goodness, Washington has made a reappearance. Yeah. And now we have the President of the United States describing Angola, a country I don't think too many Americans have ever heard of. I know there's a prison called Angola in American
States,
South, quite a big historic one, but I don't think they've ever heard of the country Angola. And he's calling it the most critical country for his administration. He was supposed to be visiting this weekend. He only canceled his visit because of Hurricane Milton, which I really hope and pray isn't doing too much damage. How would you assess the President of the United States saying that Angola is the most important country?
Well, I think it's going to anger every other country that thought it was the most important country. This is a pretty typical dating tactic. You're the special girl. You're the one. I found it surprising because I get that there are certain governments and certain leaders within Africa that are maybe more inclined to sort of a democracy and the rule of law, but at the same time, there's some fundamental countries like Nigeria that need special attention due to the terrible situation that they have in both the north and the southern part of the country with Islamic terrorism, three at last count, along with many splinter groups of terrorist activity in that particular country. So I get that Angola is one of the key players. I would have thought South Africa would have been sort of the special relationship, if you will, if we were shopping around for relationships, simply because South Africa has participated in democratic activity and supporting it with, basically trying to corral many of the other African countries to solve African problems with African resources. And it's sort of a weird situation where, as soon as there's a mineral opportunity or if there's an oil opportunity, all of a sudden the Western powers are engaged. But without that, if there's no commercial upside of engagement and a deplorable human rights situation, you end up with ridiculous scenarios like like in the UK, we're going to use Rwanda as as basically a transfer point for the migrants that are arriving here in the UK. We were going to, at our expense, send them all the way to Rwanda. They had to convince the courts that Rwanda was a safe country by passing literally legislation that said Rwanda is a safe country. And oh, by the way, this is not up for debate. So you're not allowed to debate that Rwanda is a safe country as part of their legislation. Well, change of government, like you said, and all of a sudden that project, the 200 or 250 million pounds that we spent in creating Rwanda as the third party country, that has now all pretty much gone up in smoke. And as far as I'm aware, and we have not actually delivered any illegal migrant or migrant waiting for an asylum hearing to Rwanda. So all of that money just got completely squandered. And, there is a great example of the United Kingdom thinking that Rwanda was our special girl, right? And as it turns out, that was kind of a waste of time, effort, and money. However, many of the contracting companies that I'm sure were involved in the creation of the facility down there probably did really well. So, what do they say? The antidote to bias is cynicism. And I have a fair amount of that.
Quite. And I just wanted to say on the subject of Rwanda, because the whole thing is that Rwanda is a safe country. And then I actually had this discussion yesterday. Somebody was saying to me, oh, look at the situation in Africa, the Hutus and the Tutsis, we're killing each other, now they're getting on. Well, and I had to inform them, no, well, what has happened now is we actually have a re-emergence of exactly the conflict along those lines.
Absolutely.
With the M23 rebels and a situation with Congo and Uganda where it is getting very heated. And of course, it's all about the rare earth minerals, but the ethnic divides are back and really very active again.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
It's hard to call a country safe when it's busy launching mortar and rocket attacks on its next door neighbor, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Yeah, it's just
exactly. It not a good move. I'm going to try and see if I can get this added. I want to take a look at a map, which was.
I love it when we look at the map.
I love the maps, and this is going to go back to a previous. This is going to go back to a previous interview I did with you, where I listed all the sources and so on. I don't know. Can you see that map?
Yeah, we certainly can. It's good that they make it's good that they make most of the countries like large print so folks can see it.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, where I found this map is from the King Faisal Institute in Saudi Arabia, and it's looking directly at what is Iran doing. And we have, I think the more gray the countries are, the more Iranian influence there is supposed to be in them. But just looking at this map over here, Angola is southwestern coastline on the Atlantic.
Yeah.
And I think this is why Angola is the golden child. I'm looking at this and thinking, okay, the Red Sea is pretty much taken out. The supply chain has been completely destroyed by the Houthis. When I looked into what is actually happening with the supply chain and who is benefiting and who is losing, well, Egypt is catastrophically losing because it's just billions involved in the Suez access. But also China has been relying on the Suez to get goods to Europe at a low price. Now they cannot go guaranteed. They can go, but it's not always guaranteed because the Houthis sometimes hit and miss and strike the wrong target. So now they have to go right down around Africa, right around South Africa, and all the way up again. It is adding millions and millions to the transit costs and time. So goods that are affordable, the Chinese government has to subsidize to a far higher extent to make up for this massive extension in the transit. So if I were very, very cynical, I would say perhaps the United States might look at the Red Sea and think, well, let it strangle China and India and all these countries, let them bleed out a little, while we go and we set up a completely different supply chain on the Atlantic. We have all our minerals are coming through this Lobito corridor along southern African countries that are safe. And then it's the Atlantic and we are free and clear. And we have got a massive new discovery of oil in Namibia. Very interesting thing about this Namibian oil, because I thought Namibia was largely under Chinese control. And when I heard about the discovery, first of all, just kept very quiet until not very long ago. Biggest hydrocarbon find in history before Guyana. When I looked at it, I saw that who are the companies involved? Chevron, ExxonMobil, these are all looking for licenses and so on. So if you think of it just from a sheer access point of view, here's Angola, there's the United States across the pond, and all these countries who rely on the Red Sea are tied up in a very ugly way, but one that might actually suit United States interests. Your views?
Yeah, well, you're teasing out a number of different things, and I think what's key here is that China has made a decision that it is going to essentially be a consumer of Russian petrochemicals and Iranian petrochemicals. And so China's desires are now, I think, waning a little bit in terms of like its desires for Africa. I think it looks at Africa as being capable of being developed into a rising middle class that wants consumer goods and that China will supply those. So I think China looks at Africa not so much for the some, of course, for rare earth elementals, but I don't think it's a petrochemical game anymore. I think they're quite happy taking Iranian and Russian oil at massive discounts. And, for them, it's probably, interesting that they will provide shipping and logistic support for the export of Iranian oil all over the world. In fact, I was reading a report last week ago that Japan is a consumer of Iranian oil, which, obviously makes it for quite a difficult conversation if Japan and China actually decide to have some sort of geopolitical dispute. And it turns out that fueling that on both sides is the one protagonist nation. I think Iran's involvement in Africa has really pivoted from control of natural resources and petroleum. They weren't ever really interested in that, into pure recruiting fodder for their various jihadist exportations. And to be fair, especially when we look at, through the lens of from October the 7th to just after October the 7th, a year later after the massacres, it is pretty apparent to me that the dominance of the Israeli and their partners, and these, when I say partners, I also do mean Arab nations that have supported Israel. They have been able to decimate these terrorist jihadist groups. Maybe in some cases quite spectacularly with Hezbollah, maybe not so much with the Houthis. And, certainly they've degraded Hamas, but I wouldn't say they've removed the Hamas threat. I think it was because in the mind of the Israelis, they were prepared for a conflict with Lebanon. They were prepared for a conflict with Hezbollah, who at the time was probably the scariest of all of the jihadist groups in terms of the Israeli position. That changed. There was the massacre, the intelligence failures, we were caught with, our guard down. I think Israel looked at Gaza as being almost a much safer backdoor, and it was always the northern frontier with Lebanon and Syria, and that corridor where Iran is able to move weapons and things like that between the two nations to support Hezbollah directly. So this is why I think when the war started and Gaza became, the primary focus, the Israelis did not have as much prep work, as much intelligence, as much of the network of Hamas mapped out. Okay, and this was because their focus. I don't think the argument can be said, oh, they took their eye off the ball. I don't think that's the case. When you look at the group, the biggest groups that are an existential threat to your country, if you're Israel, I think you're thinking it's Hezbollah. And I think that's why, we saw the pagers, the walkie-talkies. I think the entire Hezbollah terrorist network had been compromised by Israeli agents and double agents. The intelligence resources that Israel and the Western powers poured into defeating Hezbollah was probably, 3x what they were spending on, on the Palestinian Jihad, Fatah, or any of the other movements in the southern part of the country. So that's why I think, when Israel unleashed its offensive, which started with a bombing campaign, they knew the targets, right? They had it all mapped out. There were very few surprises, and this is why they were probably tracking in one way or another all of the top leadership of Hezbollah and decided now's the time. We're pushing the buttons. We're going to eliminate, their command and control. I've never seen a terrorist organization disassembled in such rapid time as what happened to Hezbollah. Couldn't have happened to nicer people, by the way. Okay. I think one of the biggest problems, the failure, if you will, of the West was really to support the Lebanese government. Okay, so let's kind of draw a parallel between there's a bunch of terrorists in your backyard and you're kind of powerless to do anything about it because you don't have the resources, you don't have the support, and you sort of like have to tolerate this pest, this infestation, if you will, and you really can't do much because actually when Israel crossed the border into their limited clearing operation, the Lebanese army retreated. Right?
Correct.
They basically started pulling out along with the policing and everything like that. And it was the Hezbollah fighters that basically assumed those positions and in a vain attempt to stop Israeli tanks, kind of failed spectacularly. This all comes down to one thing, Ora, and I think when we look at the lens, when you look at a sophisticated technological, I would call it a tier 1 army, easily trained to a NATO standard, if not beyond it, in terms of like the unique geographic challenges that Israel finds itself in, between their air support and their ability to coordinate close fire missions on targets of resistance, along with the careful coordination of all of the military assets on the battlefield, I think what we're seeing now is if you don't have an air force and if you don't have at least the ability to threaten an air force, your chances of actually, I think, being a substantial threat to Israel are minimal at best. And this is sort of the warning for the fisticuffs that we're seeing with Iran and Israel. And the 180 ballistic missiles, and it really didn't amount to much in terms of like damage on the Israeli side. Also, to be fair, Israel's doing a great job of controlling the media, controlling how much information gets leaked out, right? It reminds me of the ridiculous lesson that we learned during the Gulf War, where CNN was reporting on the ground in Baghdad and pretty much, was adjusting fire and air defenses down there because they were reporting almost in real time when rockets and intercepts and counter battery artillery. Yeah, it looks like those planes are coming in from the northwest and they're about to hit. Like, you can't have a real time feedback loop, right? To coordinate an air ground defensive on the public television. That's just ridiculous. So just to kind of quickly sum up, Israel was always completely ready for a fight with Hezbollah. Lebanon is kind of a failed state that has a terrorist infestation. It's on the west, and even the Arab countries, their failure to support Lebanon in being able to control its Hezbollah infection led to where we were. The Gaza, in my mind, was a bit of a sideshow, right? But what it really showed is, your posterior is always a sensitive area. And I think, Israel has learned a very valuable lesson of keeping an open mind to threats coming from all directions rather than fixating on the one big bad guy. And as for increasing escalations, to be honest, I think a regional war between Iran and Israel would be nearly impossible currently. Here's the linchpin, though. Iraq is between Iran and the border of Israel. For a real sort of traditional regional conflict, Iran would have to move across Iraq to actually threaten Israel with anything other than sort of lobbing missiles and maybe an airstrike of some sort, which the Iranians would pay, the ultimate price for. I mean, every single plane that they sent would probably not return. I think we can guarantee that. So in my mind, it's like folks that are sort of stoking the fear and uncertainty of doubt of the Middle East, and suggesting that a regional conflict is going to take place. I still think we're a ways off from that. I think this is, if you look at the whole scope from 1947 or the 1960s forward, I might consider this new adventure that the Israelis find themselves in with Hezbollah as kind of like another sort of peak in the already turbulent history of Israel in that Middle East. And to be fair, when you look at, Jordan and, Egypt, like you had said earlier, has its own problems, but Jordan, the Qataris, the Saudi Arabians, they are all very interested in economic growth. And in fact, MBS in Saudi Arabia has said economic growth is a priority. And oh, by the way, we're going to dial the old kind of rhetoric coming out of the mosques down. We're shutting the Muslim Brotherhood down. It's illegal in Saudi Arabia to be a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. He's even asked the imams or the heads of the Islamic churches in Saudi Arabia to dial back the rhetoric. And I believe in a couple of cases there were some arrests recently of the more, shall we say, militant leaders. So this bodes well, I think, and this is why Iran and Israel have a contentious relationship. They have always had it. Iran admits that it's sponsoring proxies to make Israel's life difficult. When the head of Iran went and led the prayers and everything like that, the rhetoric came out, right? But honestly, Iran has more to gain by doing nothing than doing something. And what do I mean by that? Iran wants sanctions lifted because Iran's political stability depends on its economy, and its economy is doing shitty. And so if the sanctions came off, the economic prospects of Iran go up, and the guys that are in power in Iran stay in power. That's how it works, right? If the mob is starving, the mob will find somebody that can feed them. That's been around since Roman times. The other point I want to make is Iran wants to use the nuclear capabilities that it may or may not be developing, or has been hinting at that it's going to create, as a bargaining chip for those sanctions, right? And the only reason why Russia and China are doing business with Iran, I think, is because they realize that Iran is not far away from becoming a failed state if they don't have some sort of income, some sort of revenue growth for their country. Not to mention a tremendously young population and a tremendously potentially militant population. And what did we say back when the war took out? The worst thing you can do is have an angry mob of young people and have them turn on yourself. So you need to give them something to, to get them. And this goes back to the Crusades, when, the Western part of Europe was beset with all of these young men full of, piss and vinegar. And the Pope said, maybe we need to send them over to Jerusalem so that they, will fight over there instead of destabilizing Western Europe. So I think that arc of history, which is what I love about our discussions in the Ora Report, is really the key.
That's absolutely fascinating. I did not know that about the Crusades. And of course, you have a real academic background as well in sort of religious wars and apocalyptic situations. So that adds to it.
It's interesting that ISIS, their most successful attack so far, since sort of they've been degraded, I would say, by continuous anti-terrorism operations by the Turks, as well as the Americans, who have a presence in northern Syria as well, in kind of Kurdistan. But I think it's really important to note that the two biggest attacks have been on Iran, when at the funeral, when Suleiman was assassinated, and at his funeral, and then finally, what became really interesting is the second attack was in Russia. And there have been some isolated attacks, I would say, in Europe, but it's usually sort of the lone wolf jihadist type scenario. So I feel like ISIS is still a threat, but they don't want to pick a fight right now with the West. They're more interested in doing spectacular stuff in countries that are massively distracted because of their own geopolitical situation. All right, let's digest.
I think you're absolutely right, because I'm thinking about recently the Tuareg, and apparently they are very divided in Mali. There was an ISIS Al-Qaeda type of a conflict. Well, there is one going on over there, and there is one going on in Mozambique, which is along the east coast of Africa, for people looking at the map. What you say, Russia, I actually looked into Crocus more deeply than the more recent one, and I noted that ISIS-K had taken responsibility. And ISIS-K is a little bit left field of ISIS proper. I don't know if you have any background to that. But what I looked at was, just because I always have a map of the entire globe, and I thought, well, Russia had a very serious war with Chechnya, and they were very ruthless in stamping Chechen rebels out. And they've got a brewing situation in Dagestan, and China's got Xinjiang. And if, Iran's export of terrorism works so well, then possibly Russia might find themselves in a position where they don't really want to aggravate religious leaders, lest, as you say, we've got a lot of young people in a lot of places with a lot of energy, lest they provoke some sort of a jihad in their own borders. And that could very well start eroding them from the inside out.
Oh, I think that's already underway. I mean,
Hmm.
when you look at the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh and even sort of I'm going to call it the unsettled brewings in Bosnia, not to mention the Transnistria, which is that chunk of sort of Russian sympathizers grafted onto, I think it's Moldova, if I remember the map. You're in a situation where you're 100% right, and it's going to go either two directions. It's going to go a more Islamic jihadist type of governmental. Maybe we'll see a lot more Sharia law, but also it could go very nationalistic, right? Like so it's at a fork roads right now. And Russia has to do peacekeeping in its own backyards, in those eastern stands, if you will, uh, because of that, because you do have ethnic groups that are prepared to throw down. Some of the conflicts between the ethnic groups go back 100, 300, 500 years, right? Stalin backed one side, and then that side is always perceived as being sympathetic towards Russia, and there's already somebody getting stomped on by Russia. So this is an example of how post-war transition from the Cold War to the current state, where this has only really happened, this transformation to sort of Western ideology and stuff like that. It's less than a generation long, right? There are plenty of people still in those countries that remember the heel of the Iron Curtain, no question about it. And so this has affected the psyche of these particular nations, and they've now got a taste for Western goods. And I think they'll find, without the heavy boot of Russia, they will start drifting apart. And as you eloquently put, I mean, if they drift into a more fundamentalist Islamic approach, then that could certainly kick off a number of different challenges in the region, for sure. Not to mention that China, of course, is more economically focused on developing that particular Eastern Asian market, again, for Chinese consumer goods, led by the Belt and Road initiative. And so they are spending rather lavishly on building infrastructure in those particular countries. Yeah, definitely. There's a huge transformation going on in those particular countries.
BRICS is about to launch, or at least threatening to launch, its own currency. And at the same time, we have a very interesting situation where the Taliban has now applied for membership. In your opinion, what would happen if we had a group like the Taliban as a member of BRICS?
Yeah, so it's interesting. The Taliban are distasteful for a number of different reasons. We don't need to get into them, but I would say that this does not do the BRICS brand any good, right? Like it is not the kind of people that you want. And
It's
this is the
horrendous.
interesting thing. Right now, the Taliban is the government of Afghanistan. Okay. So
Mm-hmm.
to differentiate that and to suggest that the Taliban are somehow just a group is wrong. They are legit governing this particular country with all sorts of distasteful policies that take us back to the 1500s in a lot of cases, especially the horrific treatment of women and and I'm going to say, and all those other things. So this is sort of like would be the equivalent of partnering with a 1960s 1970s era terrorist organization. Unfortunately, that terrorist organization is running another country, so they are entitled, believe it or not, under UN law to all of the protections in international relationships, despite all of the roadblocks that the West wants to throw up there. But here's the thing: even in the conflict, Afghanistan was recognized as having a potential massive wealth in its potential agricultural capabilities, but also in its mineral wealth as well. The Chinese are prepared, I think, to look completely the other way and look at what the Taliban's activities are as being internal to the country, something that they don't want to interfere with. And they've been very clear about they don't care about the internal politics, they care about the commercial opportunity. If that's the direction that BRICS is going to go, then this does make the current government, the Taliban, a more legitimate government. But again, there's nobody, I think, that has the ability to put their foot down inside the BRICS organization and say no without potentially being excluded themselves from this exclusive club of people that don't really like anything to do with the West, or at least that's the perception of it.
I think BRICS has lost a lot of prestige. There was a time where people were applying to become members and they were saying, oh no, you aren't, your economy isn't strong enough yet, and you aren't, in good enough shape for us. And now it's just, please, anybody who will have us, come on board. Taliban, Palestine, never mind, where your borders are, you have no GDP, you have no trade, you have nothing. We want you. I attribute this to, I know you did read my article on Rimland burning, and I was, just for listeners, I was referring to, there is a geopolitical theory, and it's called the Heartland, and that was created by somebody called Mackinder, and he suggested that whoever controls basically Eastern Europe, and then if you go around, you see Israel, and then Egypt and kind of into India. Whoever controls that area controls the world. And then somebody else called Strijkman came along, and he said, no, you don't have to control all of it. You just have to control the rim area. And so if you look at the conflicts that are going off, they are going off in Strijkman's rimland area, Ukraine, Israel, Lebanon. We've seen trouble in Bangladesh. It's exactly along those lines. What I noticed is Russia was very powerful and it was running oil and gas. In 2022, it was sitting high on the hog. And then we see Gazprom posts its first losses in 24 years. Suddenly, the Russian, as Nord goes and sanctions kick in, the Russian economy starts to tumble. And then more recently, with the Ukrainians invading Kursk, I was looking at this and thinking, there is a gas station, there's an LNG hub over there. Is that not perhaps what they are after? And then when I looked at the other places that were sort of being tested along the border, Bryansk was another one. And there is a pipeline that runs Kursk, Bryansk, and so on. So I'm wondering whether somebody is not perhaps strategically taking out Russian oil and gas. And by the way, on this subject, I must tell you that there is also, and I haven't been able to really confirm this, but apparently there was sabotage at Russia's Omsk refinery.
Yeah, several petroleum storage and transfer facilities have been targeted by Ukrainian drones, as well as their special forces and I'm going to call it insurgents. Right.
And in fact, I heard from you for the first time that there was a chill between Moscow and Beijing.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I started to look into it, it was like absolutely mind-blowing, from a no-limits partnership straight into a situation where Russia basically canned Siberia too, which I think is a massive, massive blow to Russia.
Well, they lost the intellectual Western support and technology, and this was part of the key thing, is that when Perestroika happened and it was like Russia is open for business, corrupt business, you had to work with the oligarchs who controlled it, but they desperately needed Western technology to do the type of extraction that they needed and to work in the harsh environments that the oil is found in. They got that technology in droves. Okay, here's what we thought when we sanctioned them. We thought that the damage that we would do, their ability to continue extracting oil, would be almost an immediate effect by sanctioning them. The Russians, being the innovative people that they are, I think this is one of the reasons why China, Russia, and Iran, who also has a lot of experience in extracting oil, um, was able to kind of prop them up for a while, right? Was able to kind of reverse engineer some of the Western pieces of technology and provide a gap, a stopgap, or a workaround, right? Because don't forget, Iran has been under sanctions for a very long time, so they know how to reverse engineer things. They're very good at taking a piece of Western technology and finding some sort of way. I mean, they still keep the F-14s that they got during the 60s, I think, flying. Even though they've been under sanction for parts, since that time. So I think what we're seeing is a couple of things. One, the ability of Russia to output dollars to build these big projects is getting limited, okay, because of sanctions and because of direct Ukrainian access. Russia needs the money to continue its war in the Ukraine. That's the number one spend, I think. I also think we're starting to see the decay, if you will, of the petrochemical infrastructure in Russia. Not happening at what we thought it would happen, but I think it's starting to really hurt. And every winter that we go into is hard on humans, but it's also really hard on technology and infrastructure. And it will decay and it will break and and things will happen. When you add in the Ukrainian I'm going to say the Ukrainians are taking what the Allies did to Germany. So, but they're doing it in a different way. So, one of the things that broke the back of the Germans was the high level aerial bombardment campaigns that laid waste to both the civilian and economic infrastructure. When we look through the lens of history, that was pretty distasteful. But that's what happens when it's an epic struggle between good and evil. The gloves come off. Ukraine hasn't pulled off the gloves yet, but Ukraine is, I think, surgically targeting the economic capabilities of Russia for two reasons. One, every dollar that Russia has to spend internally on their infrastructure, on getting things back up and running, is a dollar that won't be spent, on arms and armaments on the front line. Number one. Number two, the Ukraine realizes that the best Russian armaments are only really produced and made in Russia, and that if Russia needs more military equipment, they're going to go to I'm going to call it their second-rate partners like North Korea and Iran for equipment that is not nearly as much of a threat, right? So it degrades the actual capabilities that Russia will be able to field against the Ukrainians. And thirdly, they want to make the population of Russia feel the pain. And because what they're hoping for is an effort from within Russia that destabilizes Russia and either brings about a retreat of Russian forces from the occupied Ukrainian territories, or a much more conciliatory discussion and approach to something akin to a ceasefire, a DMZ, maybe a North versus South Korean DMZ between Russia and the Ukraine. Any way you slice it, what Ukraine's trying to do is the equivalent of high-level bombing of Germany by targeting, I think, the Russian economic output and making sure that Russia has to spend its money on the war in a less, I'm going to say, technological way and in a more palatable and easier to defend way. So I think the Ukrainians are playing a strong ground game. They really are. And, you see this in their own innovation where they're reverse engineering commercial drones and turning them into thermite raining monsters that are setting Russians on fire and Russian vehicles on fire. I saw, a couple of these innovative designs where they've taken armored vehicles and they put all this plate, and they put these cages over them and stuff like that. Well, the cage isn't going to keep out the thermite, and if you add on enough armor to a tank, it makes this lumbering thing that has terrible visibility. And actually, there's sort of a return on investment. The bigger, the uglier, and the more difficult it is to maneuver this thing, the easier it is to kill it. And if it takes two $10,000 drones to do so, that's fine, because it's like a $5 million asset that just got, cooked. So I think the Ukraine, I think the prospects for Ukrainian victory, as long as sort of Western support, and that's the big kicker, stays in place, are good. And by victory, I mean possibly the retreat of Russian forces or a palatable ceasefire agreement.
Very interesting. I was listening to Jack Carr's podcast. He has a lot of IDF special forces and ex-intelligence and so on. And he said Putin had instructed Iran no Israeli casualties because he feared a return strike on the drone factory that supplies Russia. Unfortunately, yesterday in Kiryat Shmona, I think, there were casualties from either some sort of UAV. I'm not sure if it was a drone, a missile, what it was exactly, but there were Israeli casualties. And with Netanyahu and his "we will return fire," do you see any risk here?
Minimal risk, really, honestly. This is kind of the tit for tat type of thing. Mm-hmm. Personally, when they took out the second in charge leader, Nasrallah was obliterated with 83 tons of bombs. They took out the second guy recently, but they also took out Ismail, who was an IRCG guards commander that was in town for a meeting. At that point, what Israel should have done is declared that was our response. Right? You're going to throw 180 ballistic missiles at us, and we're going to knock them down. And, there's going to be some minor Israeli casualties with that. There's also a couple terrorist incidents that spawned some gunmen, I think. And there is, a half a dozen or more Israeli casualties from a lone gunman terrorist type of scenario. I think wiping out an IRCG guards commander in a bombing raid would have been like what I would have characterized as our precision response, as opposed to sort of the wanton disregard. Because, like, when you think about it, say Israel decides that it's going to do some airstrikes in Iran. The problem is unless they're very careful about the targets that they're hitting, right? There's going to be civilian casualties, and when there's civilian casualties, there's a big fervor. If I was the Israelis, I would pick the perfect target. You know what that target is? Every single Israeli warship, because you can't deny that the warship is by definition an Israeli asset. It makes life a little bit more easier for the Red Sea, the Suez Canal, so that Iran can't sail its fast boats out there. But I would look at the Navy as being the strategic target that I would hit, because you're then pretty much guaranteed that it's degrading the Iranians' force projection capabilities into that body of water, and you're going to be isolated from, basically the claim of, well, it was completely indiscriminate and Israeli bombs, did damage to downtown Tehran. Like, there's no scenario in my mind that has the Israelis bombing downtown Tehran. Like, I don't think it's a thing. And I think that nuclear facilities are also off the table. And the reason for that is, do not take away the bargaining chip of your enemy to actually de-escalate it. So say you did degrade the Iranian nuclear program by 10 to 15 years using your bunker busters, and like blew up all the centrifuges, small ecological disaster problem there too. But say you did that. Well, now Iran doesn't have anything to come to the bargaining table with the West, right? So I think a calculated strike on military assets like the Navy and maybe the Iranian Air Force and Air Force bases and any sort of Scud missile launcher type of telerector type of capability. That I think would be where I'd invest it if I had to. And I don't think Israel has to. I don't think they're in a position right now that I don't. The Israeli people are not demanding the blood of Iranians. The Israeli people are demanding a cessation of hostilities and the return of the hostages. So I think that when I look at what is out there on the chessboard, I think Israel does not need to respond. I think they've responded in kind enough by the wiping out of the IRCG general and their continued precision strikes on Hezbollah, which is arguably, and you have to think about this in economic terms for Iran, Hezbollah has been Iran's primary investment in terms of a proxy capability in the region. And so when you keep blowing up all of the Rolls Royce of terrorist organizations, they're now going to replace those, and the whole capability will be degraded. And Iran has worked very hard to make Hezbollah a threat, and I think that's disappearing, day by day. I really do. So I think a lot of analysts are seeing it, in my mind, a bit wrong, right? In the whole arc of history, since the Roman-Jewish Wars to where we are today, the region has always been unsettled. And there's been times of conflict, and there's been times of relative peace. We're into that time of conflict where people are flexing a little bit. I don't see this as like tomorrow, the Iranian First Motor Rifle Division of the Iranian army is going to come across Iraq and try and go up against Israel. I just don't see that happening. Are they going to lob missiles back and forth? Yes. Are they going to car bomb each other? Potentially. Israel will go for the precision strikes. Iran will try mass attacks. Nothing's changed.
Yeah, exactly. On this note, I've just been checking Telegram for what is happening in Israel, and I see they have sirens in Kiryat Shmona, where they have the fatalities yesterday. There are more in the Galilee, and there are more and this is in real time.
Yeah, that's usually Hezbollah's response to the incursion that's going on in the north. Yeah,
absolutely. But we also had a missile from Yemen, and
they got to throw one out. They got to throw one out on a regular basis because they're still getting paid. And the Iranians would be like, "Have you shot anything at Israel today?" And they'll be like, "Yes, boss. We're on it, boss. We'll throw a couple of missiles at." Yemen just wants to. I think the Houthis right now are sort of like struggling to get to the table. Like no one's taking their phone calls, right? Like. I think they've fallen out of favor too with the Iranians a little bit as well.
Well, I think after Israel bombed the port of Hodeidah,
yeah,
that was a pretty impressive display, I will say, and it must have degraded their capabilities quite significantly. And
I think they turned the lights out in the country at that point because they hit power generation facilities as well as the port and some of the weapons that were there. Listen, the Israelis are not going to hit something for no reason. Okay, they're going to be very focused on. We have intelligence that there are things that are going to hurt us, or there's going to be a problem, or there's somebody important in that particular spot. That's how they roll. They don't just decide, like they don't wake up in the morning and say, "Hey, let's bomb the port of Said." They're going to have a reason. And I think that's what people don't quite understand is that there is a deep strategy game that Israel's playing, and they're controlling the enemy's decision cycles. It's not the other way around. And that show of strength of being able to turn the lights off in the country, degrade the port to the point and blow up a whole bunch of the rockets that they hadn't fired at, anyone. I think it just shows that, Israel's intelligence picture is the clearest it's ever been. maybe that's with Western help too, like the NSA and signals intelligence capabilities of the U.S. are bar none. Obviously, over here the GCHQ is supporting the British assets that we have in the field, the counterterrorism capabilities of arguably the longest running intelligence services ever, the UK, are deeply involved as well. So I think Israel has a tremendous intelligence advantage over all of the protagonists, including Iran.
I absolutely agree with you. To look back at the bigger picture, I want to ask you, okay, so we have the Black Sea, north of Sevastopol, nothing is really happening. One significant link in the supply chain is off. Then we have the Red Sea, and we have the Suez is, problematic.
Constraint.
And
yeah.
We have the port of Eilat in Israel completely closed down, and Haifa is being attacked daily. Haifa is the main port that in the supply chain between Africa, Europe, and Asia. Mm-hmm. So this is a catastrophic link in the chain to go.
This is the new economic warfare. So this is a great example. The only way you can't really defeat Israel, I don't think there is the capability, the momentum, or even the political will to do that in a region. Okay. But you can make life difficult for the Israelis. And there's a whole bunch of different ways you do that. One of them is setting their farms on fire with incendiary devices because, it makes a bit of a food crisis and it makes you have to displace people. So that's part of the campaign. The other reality is the longer you keep the reserves and the capabilities of the Israeli military and the consumption of military resources going, it's a big hit to the GDP of the country. And it's a doubly so because the Israeli reservists are a big part of the Israeli tech industry and other industries. And they, rather than producing their goods, and exporting technology and other things that the Israeli state does, they are busy, fighting for their country in the field. So there is a piece of this that is more of an economic trouble. But here's the thing. The Israeli economy is going to be far more resilient, I think, and backed by the Western nations. And the other countries around are backed by Iranian, potentially some Russian money, and then you have Saudi Arabia, who has the opportunity to come in and displace these sources of funding. So, that we've seen this in what Saudi Arabia did. I think it was in Tunisia. It was a couple of years back, but they wrote a $500 million check to wipe out all of Tunisia's debt. Okay. Now, why would they do that? Well, they probably wanted the vote of the Tunisian country for whatever thing they want to try and get through the UN at some point. They're playing a long game too. MBS is no dummy, right? And a bit of a visionary in the fact that he woke up one morning, and this is how it rolls in Saudi Arabia, and decided, you know what, women should be part of the economy. I am going to change things so that women can now have jobs. To a greater extent than they already did, opened up the opportunity for women's education. I'm not saying he's like the greatest liberator ever. Okay, let's face it. Saudi Arabia still does some pretty distasteful things, hanging, beheading, and things like that, right? But I'm just saying, like, in terms of a arm of progress, how long did it take for women to get a meaningful vote in the Western countries? And overnight, the big chief of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia can make a decision that essentially adds GDP percentages because he's now said we're going to employ women as part of our economy, as part of our new economic prosperity, and boom. Okay, we won't talk about some of the projects that are failing in Saudi Arabia because they are. Yeah, NEOM being a good example of it. And then some of the investments that Saudi Arabia has made globally haven't, paid off for a variety of different reasons. But, it's interesting to me because there's two countries in the region. Saudi Arabia is one of them, and Turkey is the other one. When you were talking about those economic theories of the middle, of that middle part of the world, I tend to zoom in and look at Turkey and its historic role of bridging East and West, of like controlling access from the Eastern European powers into the Western part. I think Turkey's a key player, and Turkey has the opportunity to step up and be a statesman like no other times. I don't think Erdogan is up for the job. I think Erdogan is too domestically looking, and he's no Ataturk. He would like to fashion himself in Ataturk, but Ataturk was Turkey's hero because he made life better for the Turkish people and brought international recognition to Turkey and its important role. And I think Erdogan has done a good job of the first part of trying to make life better for the people, right? But I don't think he's done the statesmanship piece that Ataturk brought in terms of the modern Turkey and its recognition as a vital partner to all and open for business. Because Erdogan has gone the easy route, which is to try to go a little bit more conservative, a little bit more Islamic, to appeal to the folks that are more sort of inclined to be more comfortable with that, and try to remove some of the Western influences from Turkey. I think Turkey historically has to always have a foot in Asia and Islamic, but it also has to foot in Western democracies, and is really the area that I feel has wide potential policy influence. Like, they're riding a very interesting line between being a frenemy of NATO, right, and also entertaining Russian arms sales. At the same time, I saying, hey, can we have the F-35 fighter jets? I believe when I last looked, they're not getting them. But the sale, I think, for the SS-400s, which were Russian exports, has not happened either. And there's talk that, Patriots might be, I think, the thing that Turkey will go for. But it's interesting. We've got a huge NATO base in Turkey. Turkey is the only country in NATO that could maintain an intelligence posture and subsurface submarine capability to keep an eye on the Russians in the Black Sea, because they control the Bosphorus, and they don't allow warships to pass. They're not allowing NATO warships, obviously, for political reasons, to enter into the Black Sea, but they're not allowing other Russian vessels into the Black Sea, forcing them to go north to Vladivostok instead of being able to move through the Black Sea. So it's really interesting. I think Turkey's going to be a key player. I think Saudi Arabia has a chance to step up. I actually, and maybe we want to end it pretty soon here, but I actually have hope for the Middle East and for, East Asia, because the rise of those two countries is what I hope for. Whether it'll happen is anybody's guess, but I think there's opportunity there to make things better and not worse.
Very quickly, I just have to say I agree with you. I've been looking into Saudi Arabia quite deeply, and what MBS has done, putting the religious police in jail, even legalizing the sale of alcohol in Riyadh, it's been a massive turnaround. On the subject of Turkey, I have in my geopolitics groups a very interesting journalist who pointed out that Erdogan is going through a period of extreme unpopularity, and this may be inciting him into the more conservative Islamic approach. And the other thing he said is that Turkey has a massive problem with Afghan refugees. But apparently, and that would cause problems internally.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting. Turkey is struggling in a couple of ways, mostly economic related. And of course, that makes the mob angry. And faith won't fill stomachs. And so I think there's a number of different factors. I agree that Afghan refugees is an issue. This is where Turkey, I think, could move closer to Europe, and at least sit at the table, because we have a refugee problem, period, across Europe. And Turkey is now, kind of suffering that. It's on the edge and controls the access again. So Turkey and Greece, another factor here, mostly not because the Greek economy or anything Greek is doing particularly well, but if Turkey and Greece can get along in Cyprus, which it seems like that is thawing a little bit, there is hope that that Europe could work with Greece and Turkey on the periphery of sort of the migrant problem, the illegal migrant problem, or the asylum seekers, or the economic refugees that are coming out of those areas. There's sort of a bit of a shift in policy towards Africa. And one of the reasons that America is looking at this is paying people to stay at home. So the idea is that rather than having refugees move from these countries that have strife and turmoil, the idea is to stabilize it and create almost a fake economy of paying people to not migrate. It's not a crazy idea. So long as they can get food, some relative security, some safety, and access to, food and water, and perhaps, a basic level of healthcare and sanitation, that might be just enough to keep people at home. There's always going to be those entrepreneurial ones that want to go and make the big money in Europe and look after their family. Maybe we should have something that is sort of like a 4-year economic migrant visa that you're allowed to come. It's all legal. You do, some of the jobs that other people don't want to do, that they're finding difficult, whether or not that's working in healthcare or at the lower end of the scale, and the money that you make, and you're able to bring it back to the country that you came from. But after 5 years, you go back. We need to do something, because these people aren't going to go away. It's a growing problem, and with the effects of global climate change and other things, it is a situation that we need to find a solution now, before we're forced to find a solution, because it becomes an overwhelming problem. So, when you and I sit down and talk about geopolitics, it's one thing to talk about the past. It's certainly fun and engaging to talk about the current situation, but you always have to cast an eye on the future of how we can get, I'm going to say, an idea to turn into a reality, and have countries step up that are in a position to do something about it.
Absolutely. And we could always talk for hours.
We could.
We just never run out of things. I so appreciate your time. I understand you have something of a hard stop. Thank you so much. It was so interesting. Look greatly forward to our next chat.
Yeah, we'll check in next month in November and see what the world is doing. Whether or not Florida has turned into an island or not. That's a concern.
Before you go, very quickly, a prediction. Have you got any prediction on the United States elections?
So I'm thinking it's going to be it's going to get contested. It'll be decided in the courts, is what I'm thinking. I am going to call it Kamala Harris win, but not an easy win, like not a blowout. That's what my gut tells me right now. I think, like most things in the United States that are important, there will be litigation. And I think it'll come down to a few key states where there's all sorts of disinformation and all sorts of accusations, and that the actual result of the American election is we're going to be on the razor's edge for weeks after the election. That's kind of the feeling that I'm getting.
Very interesting. I was thinking back to Al Gore and George Bush and the hanging Chad.
The hanging Chad. I think this is hanging Chad 2.0, but the problem is we don't know if the Iranians, the Russians, extreme right or extreme left groups will be holding on to the Chad. I think it's going to be mass confusion for quite a bit. And I'm hoping that America rises to the challenge of taking a step back, understanding that West Coast Americans and East Coast Americans and Middle Americans, you're actually all Americans. So please put your patriotism to your country and your belief in the Constitution and the folks that you've elected and the governance that you have to work through the situation. You know, America right now has got the strongest economy in the world. We need to keep them there. We need the American Navy to enforce the trading routes that we have. We need American power to be wielded in a I would say a statesman-like fashion, and to use their power and influence for good around the globe. That this is the opportunity for, I think, America to be patriotic, but at the same time give us their largesse and their support as the rest of the world really struggles against some pretty dark forces in countries that are making life difficult for us, the little people.
Absolutely. Please, America, no civil war.
No civil war. Yes.
No civil war. Just keep it calm. Thank you again. Ian Thornton-Trump, always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure. Thank you so much for the invite. We'll talk